Good afternoon and welcome to the National Library of Australia. I'm Nikki Mackay-Sim, Director of the Curatorial and Collection Research Section here at the National Library. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Australia's First Nations peoples as the traditional custodians and owners of this land on which we live and work, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you for attending this event, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. This afternoon's presentation, Publishing the Anti-Colonial Struggle, is by Dr Angélique Stastny, one of our 2021 National Library of Australia Fellows. The Library's Fellowships program supports experienced researchers to make intensive use of the Library's rich and unique collections through 12-week residencies. These fellowships are made possible by generous philanthropic support, and Dr Stastny's fellowship is supported by past and present members of the National Library Council and patrons. Dr Angélique Stastny holds a PhD in political science. Her work focuses on anti-colonialism and decolonisation of the Pacific, Indigenous politics, racism and critical whiteness. Her first book, Ignored Histories, The Politics of History Education and Indigenous Settler Relations in Australia and Kanaki New Caledonia, was published in 2022 by the University of Hawaii Press. Later this year, she is to start a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Melbourne. In her presentation today, Dr Stastny will discuss her research into Indigenous activist periodicals in Australia and the Pacific during the late 1960s and late 1980s, and how these periodicals still find a renewed resonance and continuing relevance in current political debates in the region 5 decades on. Please join me in welcoming Dr Angélique Stastny.
Thank you, Nikki. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very grateful and humbled to be here today and to be meeting with you all today on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I acknowledge that the sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I extend my respects to people here today who belong to other sovereign First Nations from across this continent as well. I also wish to express my gratitude to the National Library of Australia staff, my heartfelt thanks to past and present members of the National Library Council and patrons who have supported my fellowship. That they have granted me this fellowship at a time when I had no university affiliation has meant a lot to me. It shows that they see the worth of research projects beyond institution affiliations, something which is increasingly rare in today's research world, and that they may understand that life has its bends, and that a researcher may need at times to leave institutions for personal and family commitments. So really, thank you. Finally, I would like to thank the fellowship team for creating such an exciting hive of research in the Fellows Room, and thank you also to the Indigenous engagement team for their guidance and for their trust. So on to the project. So first, I would like to advise that this presentation contains names and images of people who have passed away and also covers topics that may be distressing. So by getting on board this project, I actually have come back to one of the first issues that drew my attention when I arrived in Australia many years ago. I went to Melbourne in 2011 to study regional history and politics, and shortly after my arrival, I attended a talk by activist and academic Gary Foley on his experience of the Black Power movement. Gary Foley, as you may all know, is a fantastic and thought-provoking speaker, and so that was enough to set me on my own learning and research journey. So I continued my research work for several years in Australia, analysing the mechanisms of colonialism and the processes of decolonisation. And I realised early on that as a French, I could not leak into the French colonialism in the Pacific as well. And so I have investigated this as well. In recent years, several people showed renewed interest in my earlier yet limited work on First Nations activism in the Pacific and expressed their interest in learning more about it. So that's why I'm here today. I have, however, shifted the lens and the focus, and I also greatly extended its scope. So my position, though, is not to study First Nations activism per se, as I believe that many First Nations scholars and activists can do that better than I. But rather, my intention is to read and listen to what these First Nations activists have been telling us, non-Indigenous people, for decades. I am interested in the political relation between First Nations people and non-Indigenous people, and I want to understand better non-Indigenous attitudes and responses to it from government, individual, and the community. So my project focuses here on First Nations activist periodicals from the South Pacific, published from the late 1960s to the late 1980s. My fellowship at the NLA marked the very start of that project and has included material from Australia, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and Vanuatu. The larger project, we also include material from Maui Nui, also known as French Polynesia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So at this stage, this is by no means a comprehensive analysis of these periodicals, and this is very much a work in progress. So the questions I have asked myself are, what political theory and projects did these periodicals offer? What role and responsibilities were accorded to non-Indigenous people? And what shifts did these periodicals seek to generate in the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to decolonize these societies? What lessons can be learned from the failures of past governments and society to effectively engage with those? So for this project, I have first and foremost looked into the NLA-rich collection of First Nations activist periodicals from Australia and the Pacific. I have focused specifically on Australia, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and Vanuatu. And once I analyzed these periodicals, I also studied some of the books and pamphlets that these activists wrote, and also the proceedings of some of the conferences that they attended at the time. I also looked at the mainstream press and news clippings, and read extracts from the personal papers of non-Indigenous public figures. To have a better understanding of non-Indigenous attitudes and positions, I have also analyzed the periodicals published by non-Indigenous activist groups. So, the period from the late 1960s to the late 1980s witnessed a multiplication of Indigenous activist periodicals in Australia and the Pacific. It coincided with global movement for decolonization, civil and human rights, and was influenced by Black Power discourses. The Indigenous activists and newsletters and newspapers were a key communication and political tool in an otherwise white journalistic environment. Indigenous rights organizations had been publishing periodicals for decades, especially in Australia, but the late 1960s marked a turn both in these organizations' structure and in their publications. Indigenous people demanded more control of their affairs and started replacing non-Indigenous people in the managerial positions of these organizations. So self-determination also necessitated self-publication, and several new activist groups and publications emerged. In Australia, it first started on the south and east coasts in the cities of Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Brisbane. The Foundation of Aboriginal Affairs was a cornerstone support structure for First Nations people in Sydney. Charles Perkins became manager in 1965, and that same year, the foundation started publishing the periodical Irabina. Irabina presented itself as being, I quote, for all Aboriginal people and everyone interested in Aboriginal affairs, end unquote. The Aborigines Advancement League in Melbourne started publishing a newsletter in 1967. The Council of Aboriginal Women of Australia, of South Australia, founded in Adelaide in 1966, was the first all-Aboriginal women's committee in Australia and started publishing a newsletter in 1968. So as new periodicals emerged, existing ones continued to publish until the turn of the 1970s. The tone of these pre-existing periodicals, however, usually remained one of integration of Aboriginal people into white society. At the turn of the 1970s, there was a clear move away from integration discourses, and the new decade saw an explosion of Indigenous-run periodicals. Publication also began in Brisbane, Port Augusta, Perth, Alice Springs, Darwin, Canberra, Launceston, Pukaja, formerly known as Annabella, and Palm Island, for instance. Black Australian News, Black Community News Service, Black News, and Bungie were produced. The tone of these periodicals was often more militant and straightforward in their political affirmation and claims and in their pride in Indigenous identity. The mid to late 1970s was truly the most prolific period in Australia. AIS in Launceston, which became the Black Reaction, Black Action, and then Pugana News. There was Noongar News in Adelaide, the Aboriginal and Islander Forum and Harmony in Perth, Black Liberation and BRC News in Brisbane, the Black News Service, Marina, Arturinga in Melbourne, the North Queensland Message Stick in Cairns, Kuribina, AIM and Identity in Sydney, and the Palm Islander on Palm Island, Yura Wankani in Port Augusta, and Unu Magazine in Katherine. So First Nations activist periodicals also emerged in the Pacific Islands at the time. The struggle for independence was gaining momentum in Vanuatu, then known as the New Hebrides, and the National Party started publishing the New Hebridean Viewpoints in 1971, which would become the Vanuatu Viewpoints in 1977. In Kanaki, New Caledonia, the activist 1878 group, named after the well-known activist Kanak Uprising, led by Atai in 1878, was created and published the periodical Nouvelle 1878 and Dimado. The 1878 group, together with other activist groups, later formed the Kanak Liberation Party, the Perlika, and the Perlika started publishing the periodical Kanak in 1976. So in the 1980s, new activist periodicals continued to emerge in Australia and Kanaki. Continued land rights struggle, protests against mining, Aboriginal death in custody, the 1982 Commonwealth Games in Brisbane, and the 1988 bicentennial celebrations fuel political activities. The Black Protest Committee newsletter and Black Nation were published in Brisbane. The newsletter of the Committee to Defend Black Rights, published from 1985 to 1988 in Sydney, was at the forefront of a national and international campaign which forced the Australian government to establish the Royal Commission into Aboriginal death in custody. And Courier 2 and Courier 3 were published in Melbourne, and Kurparu published in Pukaja. In Kanaki, continued police violence and repression, injustices, and the French state stronghold over the territory exacerbated conflicts in the late 1980s. The Kanakan Social National Liberation Front was formed in 1984, and the following year, the Kanak publication organization, Edipop, created the pro-independence periodical Buenando, the first newspaper of Kanaki, the subtitle read in bold letters. And Edipop also published later on La Dépêche Kanak and its English translation, The Kanak Dispatch. So the period from the late 1960s to the 1980s, with the independence of Vanuatu, the 1988 bicentennial protests in Australia, and the culmination of conflicts in Kanaki, was extremely rich in First Nations activist periodicals. They reflected the work of communities who harnessed the resources they had to make their voices heard by their own means. So these periodicals, they varied in size and they varied in design. Some were a single page, Others ran for more than 20 pages. Some were weekly, fortnightly, and others published only a couple of times a year. Yet they all defined and often had similar purposes. So the aims were, first, to ensure circulation of accurate information between indigenous people. The media at the time often ignored First Nations voices and relayed information related to First Nations people in a deeply biased way. So these publications served as a crucial platform to articulate and disseminate First Nations voices and opinions. These periodicals were also directed to non-Indigenous people. The publication Yura Wankani mentioned, for instance, I quote, "We need to let the white community know how hard we all work to achieve this," end of quote. Conscientization or critical consciousness was a recurrent purpose of publications in all three countries. In Kanaki, the newsletter Nouvelle 1878 stressed the idea that encouraging critical consciousness in almost every issue. They dedicated a lot of space to educating the reader about the French oppression of Kanak people through colonial history and the ways to fight it. Likewise, the Vanuatu viewpoints warned, not without wit, that, I quote, "In Vanuatu, a sane person needs to have 3 ears in order to remain an independent thinker. 1 ear for British incompetence, 1 for French lies, and 1 for creativity," end of quote. So this publication was also a platform to increase understanding of political systems and facilitate political organizing. The objective was to inform the community of the policies that impacted on them, but also to understand how governments work so that they knew what channels to use or what process to follow to make claims or oppose harmful policies and directives. Another aim was to inform the local community of the services that were available to them. So these included medical centers, legal services, housing, funeral funds, language classes, co-op, teaching programs, sporting clubs, arts and crafts, and so on. Most of the funding for these periodicals came from subscriptions and donations. Some periodicals even relied solely on them. Many periodicals also organized fundraising events, and several were or aimed at being self-sufficient through advertising. So let's now turn to what the editors and contributors of these journals advocated for, what political campaigns they pursued, and what political projects they generated for their community and for society. So what you see on the screen is not comprehensive, and these are what I identified for now as being the most prominent campaigns that they advocated for. I won't cover all of them individually, and you will see that many were actually interconnected. So in the face of acute social inequalities and injustices and government's failure to act effectively, self-determination became very prominent in First Nations struggles. The methods to achieve this varied according to the specificities of the territories, and First Nations organizations adopted the Black Power discourse to various extent. But they all largely agreed on 2 core principles. First, stronger cultural self-assertion and pride in the face of racism and police brutality. And second, the management of First Nations affairs by First Nations people. So all the journals I analyzed advocated for the return of decisional power into Indigenous hands. At the national level, self-determination also translated into regaining sovereignty, and in Vanuatu and Kanaki, New Caledonia, in achieving independence from colonial European powers. So independence featured in every issue of the New Hebridean Viewpoints in Vanuatu and was extremely discussed and planned throughout the 1970s in both this periodical and its successor, the Vanuatu Viewpoints. Ni Vanuatu women also gathered to consolidate cooperation. The first national conference of Vanuatu women was held in 1978, gathering 65 women aged from 16 to 67 from 23 different islands and from all walks of life to create, I quote, a common bond among Vanuatu women of unity, equality, peace, and independence, end of quote. In Kanaki, New Caledonia, the fight for greater self-determination quickly turned into a fight for the independence of the territory. In 1975, several activist groups gathered and created a steering committee for Kanak independence. In January 1976, the Provisional Office of Kanak Independence was created and became, in May, the Kanak Liberation Party. In 1979, I quote, all the opposition parties, aware that it is no longer sufficient only to denounce the system, but that it is necessary to propose some alternatives, have decided to unite to form an independentist front, end of quote. A few years later, at the height of the 1980s pro-independence movement, Kanak representative of the Kanak Socialist National Front, Susanna Unai, published the pamphlet for Kanak independence, the fight against French rule in New Caledonia. In August 1987, a hunger strike against the terms of the independence referendum set out by the French government was conducted by hundreds of people across the country, including almost 90 prisoners in Numia's prison. In Australia, the question of sovereignty led to reflection on Aboriginal nationhood. The negotiation of Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood through treaty was already part of political campaigns. In 1972, the Gwalwa Daraniki Association asked in Bunji magazine that, I quote, the government must work out a treaty with each tribe. If the whole tribe likes the treaty and signs it, then that tribe will stop fighting for their land. If the tribe does not like the treaty, then they will go on fighting for their land, end of quote. Later, in 1988, Kevin Gilbert published Aboriginal Sovereignty, Justice, the Law and the Land, which also included a draft treaty. A treaty was also advocated for in Pugana News in Launceston and suggested that Aboriginal law apply to it, that it be protected under international law, and that Aboriginal people would have total say over their local communities. So whether sovereignty was conceptualized in the form of independence of the territory or treaty or something else, a common feature appeared successively in the three territories and were landmarks in these decade-long campaigns for sovereignty. The creation of provisional First Nations governments. The National Party, later called Vanuatu Party, was formed in 1971. In 1973, it set 1977 as the date on which the territory should become independent. In 1977, as the two colonial administrations refused the Vanuatu Party's demands for self-government and independence, they boycotted the elections and created a People's Provisional Government, which existed until the election in November 1979. Until the election win, sorry. In December 1984, the FLNKS in Kanaki agreed to the creation of the Provisional Government of Kanaki and adopted the Kanaki flag as emblem. Finally, the Aboriginal Provisional Government was formed in July 1990, based on the principle that Aboriginal people had not relinquished their sovereignty, and it has campaigned for self-determination and self-government. So sovereignty was, of course, interconnected to the question of land rights. Land rights feature in all publications I have analyzed during this fellowship and was the crux of the colonial problem. Land rights were claimed across all three territories. So I don't have time here to actually go through all in detail and to do justice to the amount of work and political activity that First Nations people put in this issue. So I will just point out that land rights claims were battles fought for over many years, even decades, slowed down by the institutional conservatism and administrative hurdles they faced. And these struggles involved sit-ins, demonstrations, petition to the government and to the Queen in the case of Australia, legal cases, and the list goes on. Pat Catinieri explained in Yura Wankani that, I quote, "Land rights is not just talks about mining and minerals and who will receive money and how much. Land rights is a question about people and their survival, their right to survival." End of quote. The use of tent embassies was also a significant way to campaign for land rights and sovereignty and thrust it into under international attention. In addition to the tent embassy, started in 1972 opposite Parliament House in Canberra and continuing to this day, several other embassies were also temporarily created across the country, temporarily in the following years. The concept of paying the rent by non-Indigenous people emerged in the late 1980s. It served to reaffirm First Nation sovereignty and right to land and support self-determination. The campaign featured in the September 1989 issue of Courier 3, and the magazine also included an example of what a lease could look like. In Vanuatu and Kanaki, New Caledonia, First Nations called for return of all Indigenous lands as well. The 1878 group in Kanaki stated in its periodical that the Kanak people was fighting for the return of all Kanak lands, I quote, "because they have the right to have their own country," end of quote. Another major campaign, the fight against nuclear power, from uranium mining in Australia to nuclear testing in Moruroa, also featured in these periodicals. So critiques of uranium mining and French nuclear tests featured in many activist periodicals in Australia, as well as in Vanuatu and Kanaki. In 1978, Bungie predicted that, I quote, "like a boomerang, uranium will come back to us in rockets and bombs," end of quote. The Black News Service published a booklet on nuclear-free Pacific, and journals in Vanuatu regularly voiced their concerns and supported Tahitian anti-nuclear activists. The campaign for a nuclear-free Pacific was an issue that further consolidated solidarities among anti-colonial activists in the South Pacific and beyond. So periodicals, they often strove to internationalize the struggle and regularly featured news from overseas. When a young Kanak was murdered by the French police in Kanaki in 1975, Black News Service in Australia encouraged its readers to inform sympathetic groups, send telegrams and letters of support for Kanak independence to one of its forefront figure, Dewe Gorode, to send letters of protest to the governor of New Caledonia. It also called for sympathy demonstrations, the picketing of French embassies, and the boycott of UTA French Airlines. Nouvelle 1878 in Kanaki published news from Vanuatu, Timor, New Zealand, Fiji, Micronesia, etc. And they had a regular section on anti-colonial struggles overseas and covered the hikoi in New Zealand, the imprisonment of Aboriginal activists in Australia and their land rights conferences. The New Hebridean Viewpoints and later the Vanuatu Viewpoints had a section called Over the Horizon, covering news from overseas in which the Kanak struggle featured regularly, if not systematically. All these periodicals are a wealth of information on solidarities across the Pacific. The most telling example of these solidarities was the creation of a Pacific People's Action Front and their publication of a bi-monthly newspaper, Povai, from 1975, which was written in French and in English, with a circulation of 10,000 copies. From 1981, the newsletter was released by the Vanuatu Pacific Information and Community Center in Vanuatu Viewpoints. So these Indigenous activist publications also documented activist trips overseas. They traveled on many occasions to present their campaigns on the international stage, to give support to other First Nation struggles, but also to learn about self-determination and sovereignty from examples overseas. In 1972 and 1973, First Nations people from Australia went to China on 2 occasions to learn about the situation of tribal people, the education system, and the role ordinary people play in decision-making and control of their affairs. These trips were fully funded by the Chinese government. However, activists who partook in these trips often paid a heavy cost, losing their job or study fellowships on their return. In the late 1970s, Gary Foley and Bruce McGuinness opened an Aboriginal Information Centre in London. In 1978, Walter Linney, president of the Vanuatu Party, and Barack Sope, the Secretary General, addressed the UN Decolonization Committee regarding the situation in Vanuatu. They also took this opportunity to reaffirm their solidarity with other First Nations, and they declared, I quote, "Our struggle against French and British colonialism cannot be isolated from the struggles of our brothers and sisters in the South Pacific region. We strongly feel that we cannot be totally free if Vanuatu becomes an independent state, and yet colonialism continues in other parts of the South Pacific region." End of quote. In 1985, the provisional government of Kanaki sent a delegation to the Vanuatu Party Congress, and there were also representatives of the Free West Papua movement and the Tahitian independence movement. Still in 1985, Kanak activist Susanna Unai toured the US to raise an awareness about the colonial struggle and gather support and funds for the creation of a Kanak radio newspaper. And in the 1980s, she also became involved in the Maori sovereignty movement in New Zealand, speaking at Menihui. So these are just a few examples, but as you can see on the map, the contacts were numerous. And this shows only a fraction, actually, of the trips that were made over that period. First Nations cooperation was also facilitated by the numerous international forums and conferences that these activists attended and which were reported in their periodicals. So again, what you see on the map is not exhaustive, but only indicative. So I will just mention 2 of them to give you an idea of the work put into such initiatives and some of the impacts that they could generate. So the Conference for a Nuclear-Free Pacific, held in 1975 in Suva, Fiji, was attended by some 90 delegates from across the Pacific to oppose nuclear testing in the region by France, the United States, and Australia. Women such as Dewe Gorode, Cheryl Buchanan, and Amelia Rokotuivuna from Fiji played a crucial role in the discussions showing the connection between colonialism, militarism, and nuclear testing. The Nuclear, Free, and Independent Pacific movement actually grew out of that conference. Further nuclear-free Pacific conferences were held at Pohnpei in Micronesia, in Hawaii, and in Vanuatu in 1983. At the 1983 Nuclear-Free Pacific Conference in Vanuatu, the People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific was adopted. Article 1 stated, for instance, that a Pacific nuclear-free zone be declared, and Article 4 that the peoples and governments signatory to this charter will work to ensure the withdrawal of colonial powers from the Pacific. And 3 years later, the Treaty of Rarotonga and the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty entered into force. Participants to the South Pacific Regional Women's Conference in 1975 in Suva, Fiji, came from many places: American Samoa, Australia, Canada, Cook Islands, Fiji Islands, Gilbert Islands, Guam, Hawaii, Jamaica, Micronesia, New Caledonia, New Hebrides, New Zealand, Niue, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tahiti, and the US. Resolutions of the Pacific Women's Conference supported that the titles of all lands being returned to Aboriginal people be freehold and not leasehold, and that the Department of Aboriginal Affairs be taken out of the public service and total control be given to the Aboriginal community. that the independent and self-governing nations in the Pacific support territories under colonialism wanting to achieve self-government, namely the independence movement of New Caledonia, New Hebrides, Micronesia, and the autonomist parties of French Polynesia. A cable supporting the Maori Land March was also sent to the marchers camped on the steps of Parliament House in Wellington, in New Zealand. And following that conference, the Pacific Women's Resource Center and Association were created. So, in view of such vast and powerful political activity, both at home and internationally, from First Nations people, how did non-Indigenous people respond to these activists running the periodicals? So, while the sense of Black Indigenous solidarity regenerated and consolidated First Nations activism in the region, a shift of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, fueled by stigmatizing and sensational press coverage, resulted in many cases in a fall in non-Indigenous support and the interruption of these periodicals for lack of funding. Despite First Nations initiatives to reshape political relations with non-Indigenous people, the shift from non-Indigenous to Indigenous leadership and the emergence of Indigenous-led activist groups and campaigns for self-determination, sovereignty, and land rights were portrayed as white alienating processes by the media. As a result, while several of these periodicals existed for several years, even for over a decade, many actually only lasted a few years or less. Some of these periodicals were often printed with very little means, requiring a great deal of effort and organizing for its editors. An editor of Kuribina reported, for instance, I quote, "We don't own any equipment of our own and are therefore forced to wait until out of hours or spend a great deal of time lining up a few hours on this typewriter and a few hours on another somewhere else across town." End of quote. So these publications also faced an overtly hostile and racist environment. In Kanaki, for instance, some activists were assaulted by anti-independence and anti-Kanak extremists, and bomb attack attempts were made on the premises of the newspaper Buenando to silence them and deter them from publishing. So despite the lack of government support for First Nations rights and the lack of fall in support from the wider society, several individuals continue to campaign alongside First Nations people for justice, land rights, and sovereignty. Earlier on, in Sydney, the Cooperative for Aborigines, established by the Reverend Alf Clint in 1957 in Glebe, continued to provide training for Indigenous people from Australia and the Pacific, and supported self-determination until the Tranby Cooperative achieved to reorganize its board and had a fully, like a majority of Aboriginal members and an Aboriginal chairperson in 1980. Alf Clint also helped to set up Operation Aborigine, I quote, "a black-white organization dedicated to the liberation of Aboriginal people and total support for the All Aboriginal Control organization in their fight for justice." The publication Guriala was its official organ and was in operation from 1979 to 1981. The Society of Friends organized conferences on land rights. Friends of the Earth took part in the fight to stop uranium and camped on the uranium fields near Jabiru in the 1970s. And several thousands of students, workers, and unions took part in the Black Moratorium for Land Rights on July the 14th, 1972. In 1979, an informal meeting of eminent Australians formed the Aboriginal Treaty Committee, and they published a newsletter to press for a treaty which could provide a kind of constitutional basis for the relationships of Aboriginal Australians to the Commonwealth and Australian society generally, and to provide a focus for white political support for the Aboriginal cause. In 1979, Stuart Harris, for the Aboriginal Treaty Committee, wrote the book It's Coming Yet, an Aboriginal Treaty within Australia between Australians. In 1985, Judith Wright published a book, We Call for a Treaty. Likewise, the Action for Aboriginal Rights in Northern Victoria published a newsletter, Aboriginal Action from 1976 to 1979, and Action for Aboriginal Rights from 1980. So the organizations also published a resources kit on racism and Aboriginal rights in 1987, as well as a survey of Aboriginal Australians and their land rights. On an individual level, legal scholar and activist Garth Netheim was known for his work advancing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights. In his contribution to Message Stick in 1985, he declared, I quote, "The detail of Aboriginal land rights has to be hammered out afresh in the different parts of Australia. But as long as all legitimate interests are taken into account, as long as the original wrong of depossessions is not remedied, the granting of land rights to Aboriginal communities appears to offer the best hope of providing some justice to the original owners of the continent." End of quote. In Kanaki, New Caledonia, the power distribution was very different. Non-Indigenous supporters for Kanak's land rights and independence of the territory were very few at the time. And those non-Indigenous people who supported Kanak people and the independence movement were on several occasions the target of violent attacks. On the 19th September 1981, Pierre de Clercq, General Secretary of the pro-independence party Caledonian Union, was shot down in his home. The suspect was jailed for 10 months, but then released, compensated, and pardoned in 1990. The case would remain unsolved, and the case remains inaccessible until the year 2100. In 1997, a pro-independence family saw its bakery burned down, caused by an arson by loyalist extremists, and a journalist was beaten up shortly after having interviewed pro-independence leader Jean-Marie Djibaou. So in such a violent context, a group of people, although against independence, called for opening up a dialogue with Kanak people. Éric Douillère and Jean-Raymond Postic created the Union of Caledonians for a dialogue with the Kanak people. However, support for the Kanak struggle for liberation more often came from other countries in the region than from within the territory. The Socialist Workers' Party in Australia supported the New Hebrides National Party and the Kanak independence. In Sydney, a group of supporters of Vanuatu independence formed the Australian Vanuatu Independence Committee and published the news and information bulletin Selihu from November 1977 to the independence in July 1980. The aim of the bulletin was to cover, I quote, "the struggle of the Vanuatuan people for real and immediate independence, as well as, I quote, the struggle for the Kanak people of New Caledonia for independence from vicious French colonial domination," end of quote. The Kanak Group 1878 was also supported by the Socialist Party of Australia, and in Canberra, the ACT Kanak Support Group was set up in April 1985 to facilitate contacts between Australians and the Kanak independence movement. And they started a periodical, the Canberra Kanaki Bulletin. So Kanak people also found support among Pakeha New Zealanders. In 1985, the New Zealand Federation of Labour encouraged boycotts of Kanaki French products and services, distributed information in support of Kanak independence, sponsored solidarity tours by Kanak unionists, and sponsored and funded the establishment of a Kanak radio station in Kanaki. The French government tried to prevent these solidarities from taking place by refusing entry visas on several occasions. So in 1996, for instance, the French embassy in New Zealand refused entry visas to union members, pacifists, and activists based on the new anti-terrorist law. Buenando pointed out that France blows up boats in New Zealand and calls New Zealanders the terrorists, end of quote. So, as my fellowship was drawing to a close, I tried to have a look at the bigger picture, to understand what all these materials were telling me for now about this period and of the lessons to be learned. So First Nations activism clearly took a compelling turn during that period. The sense of international solidarity regenerated and consolidated First Nations activism towards self-determination and sovereignty, and so much was achieved with little resources. The periodicals and newsletters they published profoundly shaped the political debate and the Indigenous media scene in these societies. The Indigenous activist groups were seminal in the rise of Indigenous publishing industry and in Indigenous news media in these societies in the following decades. There were gains also on several other levels. Community programs, for instance, improved Indigenous people's lives, and their positive impact continue to this day. Yet, when it comes to the core of First Nations political projects and campaigns, land rights, sovereignty, treaty, or independence, the outcome was slightly different, except in the case of Vanuatu. To borrow the words of late Jagera Man and MP Neville Bonner, often there was, I quote, no security, no comfort, no final victory, end of quote. So land rights legislation during that period were often continued to be taken up by governments only to be abandoned later. Treaty was sidelined and only came back on the political agenda in some parts of the country in more recent years. And in Kanaki, New Caledonia, this Kanak struggle for independence was hit a hard blow during the 1988 Uvea massacre. The military superiority of France was such that pro-independence Kanak people resorted to sign peace agreements with the hope of gaining the trust of non-Indigenous people, and that gaining independence was just a matter of a few more years of groundwork. However, the French government and local loyalist people have since then entrenched their positions and continue today to do their best to prevent the independence of the territory, to remove New Caledonia from the UN list of non-self-governing territories, and to force their own terms onto Kanak people amidst complete disinformation. To crown it all, in June this year, Gérald Darmanin, French Minister of Home Affairs and Overseas Territories, visited Kanaki, New Caledonia to discuss the future of the territory. To a question on France's support for local energy transition to carbon-neutral energy, Darmanin declared that he is open to considering the development of nuclear energy in New Caledonia. So specters from the past seem to reappear. So on one hand, my desk was overflowing with First Nations periodicals from the better part of my 3 months here, and more materials were awaiting me on a trolley, on a shelf somewhere in other sections of the library. And on the other hand, almost till the very end, I was also at my desk trying different keyword searches again and again in the hope of finding more non-Indigenous periodicals that would testify of non-Indigenous activist groups specifically dedicated to fighting alongside First Nations over this period for justice, better cohabitation, and also, very importantly, against racism. Non-Indigenous voices involved in struggles for justice, First Nation sovereign rights, and against racism were few in comparison to the proportion of the non-Indigenous populations. So archives are certainly not dry documents, and so many different emotions came to me during that fellowship. As I was reading through these archives, I was not only impressed by the huge work that had been put into all these campaigns for what really are basic human and political rights and justice, but I was also angered and distressed that these debates had been going on for so long. I was also struck and moved by the considerable thinking and generosity of spirit that First Nations people showed on how to accommodate non-Indigenous people in their territories and how to change relations that would work better for all and be more just. In 1982, Michael Manzo wrote in a 1982 issue of Pugana News, I quote, "Although we have come a fair way in recent years, we still have a long way to go. But although the fight will be hard, it is not impossible." End of quote. So this question briefly crossed my mind. What if non-Indigenous people at the time had flooded the media with campaigns for justice and against racism, the same way that First Nations people wrote thousands and thousands of pages on those issues during that period? But then I turned to a more practical and useful question about our present, about my own position, the possibilities that I and we all have in our hands to effect change from wherever we stand. And one fundamental lesson that First Nations periodicals do teach me is that despite circumstances, a lot can be achieved with goodwill and determination. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Angelique. That was just fabulous, seeing the periodicals out of the stacks and being used so well, and yeah, so still so pertinent. Now, we do have lots of time, a bit of time, I think, for questions. I shouldn't say that, should I? I'll get in trouble. Now, we are being recorded, remember, so we do have microphones for you if you have some questions. So be upstanding, arise, ask some. Oh, here we have.
Thanks, Angelique. That was a really fantastic and interesting talk. I've got many, many pages of notes. But just a question. Periodicals seem to be a medium that largely speak to people who are already activists or radicalized, and so might not capture the attention of a broader society. Do you find that authors of those early periodicals from the 60s and 70s then go on to move into other fields of communicating those ideas, like academia or politics? You mentioned Gary Foley in the beginning, who I understand is very active in academic fields.
Yes, so I think, thank you. I think you're right for like to point out that perhaps it couldn't touch like a very wide audience, although when they were doing these fundraising activities, they were often, the point was also not only to raise the funds, but also to actually spread the word within the larger community. And so many of these activists, as you said, usually had work in different positions, and also moved on to a lot to the academia, to the arts as well. So many were also artists and used the art, because the arts can be a very powerful medium to actually put messages across. So you actually had mostly the academia and the arts for these activists, from what I've seen so far. But as I said, I'm at the very start, so I guess I'm going to find out more. In the case of Kanaki New Caledonia, a lot of them also went into the institutions. So when you had the piece, it already started in the 1980s when they started forming political parties, because they realized that the fight also had to be led from within the institutions. And so many actually got engaged in these political parties, and then continue for many decades to actually engage with non-Indigenous people and to advance their campaigns through these institutions.
Hello. Yes, thanks from me as well. That was a really wonderful talk, and you've done some fantastic research here. I'm just wondering, though, as well as along with the aim that you articulated of spreading accurate information to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, I find it really interesting that the publications are largely in the languages of the colonisers. And I'm just wondering if, firstly, if you've come across much literature that's actually in a language, a local language. And secondly, if there's not, do you think that reflects the fact, especially for cultures where written languages are not the primary means of communication, whether there might be a kind of alternate circulation of information and push from those communities in their own languages, which would be largely more likely to be taking place through things like radio or film?
That's a very good question. To be honest, I haven't looked into non-colonizers' language output. That would be, I guess, a whole new project, or that would extend it very. It is a very interesting question. For the publications I've looked at, they're all in English. There's the one in Annabella that was published in Pijajanjara and English, and actually 2/3 of the content was mostly in Pijajanjara. That's so far what I've seen. There might be others, because as I said, it's really not comprehensive, so I don't claim to actually have covered it all, but that's the one I found so far. And in Kanak, New Caledonia, so the interesting thing that I didn't mention about the Kanak independence movement was that it's one of the reasons that I guess, I mean, there are many reasons, but one thing that really sparked it was that Kanak activists had been jailed for publishing in Kanak languages anti-colonial leaflets, because back then in the 1970s, Kanak languages were still banned. It's only in the 1980s when Jean-Marie Djibaou, pro-independence leader, was for a short period of time at the head of the local government that these laws were repealed. So I'm not too sure. To be honest, I have to do more research in Kanaki around activist periodicals to see if there were periodicals written in some of the Kanak languages.
Yuma, thanks, Angelique. That was fascinating. I work here at the library, so I just wanted to acknowledge my library forebears who collected all of this material to make it discoverable. And I, with colleagues in this room, lead our current overseas collecting, and we have a focus on Melanesia, and of course many of the countries you've mentioned are part of that. I guess my question is, you mentioned, which really struck with me, around self-determination sort of means self-publishing. And I'm wondering, we've noticed that it is getting harder to collect publications from the Pacific, perhaps because not many things are being published there now, or they're being published in ways that are harder to collect. So a print, newsletter, periodical is now maybe a Facebook group or doesn't exist. And I guess I'm just curious, I know that your research is looking into past publishing, but if you have any sort of comments on how, particularly in the New Caledonia experience, where they're still fighting for independence, where are those activists publishing now, if they still are?
Yeah, that's a very good question. To be honest, there would be a lot to say about that. In short, I would say that unfortunately, the First Nations media scene is very different from the one in Australia, where it's very rich and it has evolved and grown so much over the decades. After these periodicals, the political parties, the Kanak pro-independence political parties, continued to publish their publications. There was, when Ando stopped, then there was another one called Moave, which was very good, that lasted for many years, but it stopped, if I'm not mistaken, around the year 2010 or perhaps even before. And there's one activist publication that I know of, which is called L'Élan des Conques, and which is published by a group of Kanak people in New Caledonia. But I guess there would be a lot of work to be done on that. And I guess the media scene in Kanak, New Caledonia is, just to make it short, there's a new daily newspaper that just started last week. But before that, there was not even a daily newspaper for 2 months. It was interrupted because for lack of funding. And except for that daily newspaper, you have one weekly, and that's pretty much it. So I think the information situation and the news situation in New Caledonia is very serious in a way and very alarming. You do have channels and TV channels, etc. But I think much more needs to be done to actually have a variety of information, especially in this time and age, and regarding the continuing struggle for independence.
Thank you. The slides that you showed really profiled a lot of amazing visual culture, and there was some, just great design and typography and sketching. So I was wondering, if you could speak to the visual culture there, did you think about it and consider? Did you use that as kind of in your analysis? Did it come into your framework?
Yeah, I've realized that depending on the periodicals, but some of them have really amazing artworks, and a lot of, many were also hand drawn, depending on the time and on the resources they had. For now, I haven't included it yet in my, reflection or in my analysis of it. I think I need to sit and have more time to actually look at it all, and also because some of them. are not complete archives, so I also need to, track down if I can find some, missing issues or not, or if they, just don't exist anymore. But I think there's a lot, and it's interesting because you can also see, depending on the periodicals, some of them were, are really full of cartoons and hand-drawn illustrations, and political cartoons, and others also prioritized. Pictures, like images, because they were saying that it's a political tool, and we also need, like the readers need to know who is in the community. So it was also a way for the community to get to know each other. So, for instance, who were running such and such organizations and services. So there was, different purposes for that, but it would be a very interesting thing. So thanks, thanks for raising it.
One last question. Oh, we are in the front again. Righto. Well, in that, I'll just wind up quickly then. Just some quick plugs before we close for the day. I hope you can join us for our next fellowships lecture, Parky's Club, a modern arts salon in interwar Sydney, which will be delivered by 2023 Library Fellow Dr Deirdre O'Connell. That'll be on the 3rd of August at 5:30. This lecture will explore the extraordinary influence of Augusta Parky McDougall, who brought suffragist activism, Greenwich Village salon culture, and the little theatre movement to interwar Sydney. It sounds really, really interesting. If you want to catch up on any of our recent talks and performances by other library fellows, you can always find the recordings of these on the library's website and the library's Facebook page and YouTube channel. So thanks very much everyone for attending today, and if you'd like to join me in thanking Angelique for her fascinating presentation again.